Hello and welcome to the weekly climate show. And we're going down to the woods today with an in-depth film from the Amazon alongside a look at the global woody picture, revealing where in the world tree cover is actually growing. We'll hear the latest from the Global Climate Summit in Egypt, COP27. And what about the weather here? Is it wet enough for you? Is it wet enough to avoid drought next year? And we'll be asking if we are finally seeing meaningful rain. But now we're heading to the trees, the Amazon jungle, where so much wildlife dwells, where so much carbon is stored and millions of people live. Its survival is key to a stable climate, and it's kind of at the heart of our shared global environmental conscience. The Amazon basin is absolutely huge. To give you some idea of the scale, it is twice the size of India and 28 times bigger than the UK. It spans 9 countries across South America, but most of it lies in Brazil. And under the regime of the recently defeated president, Jair Bolsonaro, deforestation reached a record high. Satellite data shows nearly 1,500 square kilometres of rainforest, that's around the size of Greater London, was chopped down in September alone. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, travelled to the state of Rondônia and the indigenous territory of Caripuna, where his team made this beautiful and powerful film.
The pristine canopy of the Amazon rainforest is breathtaking when seen from the air. It is absolutely vast, spanning 9 countries in South America. It's the most biodiverse place on the planet, home to 10% of the entire world's wildlife. There are nearly 400 billion trees that release billions of tons of water into the air every day and stores billions of tons of carbon in their trunks and branches. The world needs the Amazon, but it is being destroyed on an industrial scale every hour. And Brazil is the greatest offender. This is one of the latest attacks on the forest in the state of Rondônia. Teams of loggers move in for the wood, followed by teams clearing the land for beef farming. This is completely illegal. 95% of it is. This belongs to an indigenous group, and it's being stolen. Rondônia's rainforest is being systematically destroyed. It's one of the worst affected areas in the country. The Amazon rainforest, the Amazon River and its enormous tributaries are home to 30 million people. Many live a simple life in near isolation on the banks of the river. But their livelihoods, even their lives, are in danger from the spread of the farming industry and its land grab. Vanderlei da Cunha joined us on the river to show us the way to his friend's home and whose land is being invaded by ranchers. Vanderlei used to live here. We stopped next to his former land. He was forced out one day when an armed rancher threatened to kill him.
Aí ele pegou e o parceiro dele, do rapaz, do homem que se apresentou como dono, puxou a arma e mencionou assim. Aí eu sentado no que eu estou aqui, aí falou assim, olha, se você sair daqui por bem, você vai sair daqui por mal, ou vivo ou morto. Se no caso morto, a gente joga você na água e você desce de bubuia aí se o jacaré não te comer. Caso contrário, alguém te acha e morre. Ou então, você tem a opção de sair daqui vivo.
In these remote areas, there is little river traffic and little sign of life. You glimpse the occasional house, sometimes passing moored canoes. There are people here, you just don't see them. A couple of hours later, we catch sight of Vanderlei's friend and come ashore. He's bailing out water from his canoe and it looks pretty swamped. He tells me, however, it was just last night's rain. There's loads of these small communities. They're really remote. And the problem is they're having to fight to hold on to their land because the farmers are encroaching upon them. And so they've got no choice but to try and keep it on their farms and hope that they don't get invaded by people who can be extremely violent. These river people are not indigenous, but they're not commercial farmers either. They basically live off the land, which they are licensed to hold, and over the years move within their territory. Like the indigenous, who they are close to, they can only cut down an acre or so of trees a year. For the forest, that is totally sustainable. Almir and Maria's land is being stolen by commercial farmers. They're unable to protect themselves, and the authorities do nothing to help them. It's left them angry and afraid of what the future holds.
1.200 metros aqui já é outra fazenda. Outra fazenda. 1.200 metros.
Ele chega com o trator, a porta aqui, ele fica na barra. Tudo armado. Lá só eu e ele que mora aqui. Lá não tem ninguém para proteger. Aí lá chega...
Eles fazem levantamento assim, de quando descobrem que a pessoa é, por exemplo, é 2, 3, que nem ali.
It's estimated 17% of Brazil's rainforest has been cut down over the past 50 years. It may not sound a lot, but scientists warn of what they call the tipping point. That is when the forest can't sustain its tropical climate and basically dries out. The tipping point is at 25% of trees gone. It's that near.
The Amazon rainforest is magnificent and it looks pristine, but actually beyond this tree line, the land and the trees have all been cut down and it's being turned into farmland. And that is something that the indigenous people keep making the point, is that their lands are being encroached upon. They fear that they're fighting a battle that they may well lose and that all of this will be gone one day.
Further downstream, we arrive at the home of an indigenous group, the Carapuna. Like so many of the indigenous groups in the Amazon, they depend on the forest and the river to survive. The forest is disappearing, and so too are the animals and fish that the indigenous live off. The Carapuna have been here for generations. Once remote, their community has been decimated by disease from outsiders. Their numbers have dwindled. Now they are losing their hunting land at an astonishing rate. Their leader, Andre, has just returned from important meetings with other indigenous heads. Protecting their land dominates all discussions between the groups. Hi. How are you? Nice to meet you. He introduced me to Aripa, the oldest surviving member of the Carapuna, who has witnessed the devastating changes to the forest. What do you think will happen to, not so much you, but the next generations? Andre took us just 3 kilometers from the Carapuna village to show us how the loggers and ranchers are moving in. This was pristine forest just weeks ago. Now it's a desolate wasteland of felled trees. The track to the village was closed down by the ranchers for a year as they set to work on destroying the forest. And this is what they put in. And so the effect is that it kills everything underneath and grows up through the ground.
Aí planta, joga tudinho. Então, para nós, Caripuna é muito sagrado ter floresta em pé. Com a floresta em pé tem a água saudável, e a água para nós é vida e para outras populações. Então, para nós é muito sagrado ter a floresta em pé. Tudo que tem na floresta tem que viver, porque se destruir a natureza, destrói tudo que tem nela. Então, para nós é muito sagrado.
The destruction of the rainforest right into the so-called protected land of the indigenous communities is happening across Brazil's Amazon. What were once tracks are now mud roads and grass. Felled trees are everywhere. Only the castanheira tree, from which we get the Brazil nut, are left standing. Cutting them down is completely illegal and the wood can't be sold. but they're often dead anyway. Well, this is what happens in the Amazon, and what's really interesting, actually, and we're now in an area that has been attacked recently and deforested, and this tree behind us, have a look at this, absolutely enormous. Well, it's been killed with fire, and so one of the enormous branches at the top has come off, blocking the track that we're using to get to the village, which is still a few miles away. Bravo. This is what the destruction is all about. Enormous commercial farms stretch as far as the eye can see. This was all dense forest, cleared away for agricultural progress. Intensive bee farming has made Brazil the second biggest exporter in the world after the United States. It's the fourth largest grain producer, and from its enormous soy plantations, it sends high-protein cattle feed to countries like China and Spain. Chai Suri is the face of a new generation of environmental activists who speak truth to power. Their message is simple: the forest and the people of the forest must be protected, or the world will suffer.
If I ask to each person, they will answer that, yeah, I know that the Amazon are burning, but they don't really know what this means. And this means our death. This means that they are not cut the trees, but they are killing us. They are inside our land, in our homes. Imagine you in your home and somebody just get in and destroy everything and threat your family and say, yeah, now just your home is mine.
The world knows what's happened to the Amazon rainforest and has called for it to stop. But it isn't stopping. In fact, it's actually getting worse. Every year, the deforestation record is being broken. The forest and the people of the forest need help. The tipping point is very near.
Stuart Ramsey there in the Brazilian Amazon. Let's broaden things out now and look at deforestation across the globe. Forests still cover nearly a third of the world's land area, but that figure is shrinking. Since 1990, the world has lost over 400 million hectares, or about 1 billion acres of forest, mainly in Africa and South America. However, the rate of loss has slightly slowed over the past 3 decades. In the most recent 5-year period, 2015 to 2020, the annual rate of deforestation was estimated at 10 million hectares, down from 12 million hectares for the 5 years before. And parts of the world gained a significant area of tree cover over the past 2 decades. According to data from the World Resources Institute's Global Forest Watch, nearly 131 million hectares of land transitioned from having no forest to having one between 2000 and 2020. That's an area twice the size of Ukraine. More than half of the newly planted land was in Russia, Canada and the United States, but they also felled huge swathes of forest. But 36 countries have had a net gain in woodland in that 20-year period, like China, India, Poland, Pakistan, Algeria and, albeit modestly, here in the UK. Growing trees don't store much carbon, but they will in the future, whereas older trees hold carbon now and their loss can release it to the atmosphere. And if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can listen to our ClimateCast podcast, where we look at deforestation in more detail and the impact of Brazil's recent election on the future of the Amazon. You can subscribe to ClimateCast for free wherever you get your podcasts. You're watching The Climate Show. Coming up, it's been a pretty wet November, but find out why the rain hasn't been quite meaningful enough to quench the summer's drought. Welcome back. You're watching The Climate Show with me, Tom Heap. The COP27 summit is around halfway through in the Egyptian Red Sea resort of Sharm el-Sheikh, and progress seems to be limited. I'll be in Sharm next week to see for myself what's going on. But earlier I caught up with our climate change and energy correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, and asked how she sees it.
Where are we a week in? You know, it's at this strange point after a week of wrangling where diplomats and countries start putting forward their sort of texts for agreement. I think we've had the entire conversation, though, politically dominated by this issue of loss and damage. Poor and low-income nations, most vulnerable to climate change, having done the least to cause it, demanding compensation now from the rich nations who've driven the climate crisis, and wanting agreement about more than just a continuing conversation here at COP. But I can tell you that Western climate diplomats are really concerned, I mean, particularly the Americans, that the loss and damage issue is kind of serving as a bit of a distraction from solving the problem, to be frank, from decarbonising the world, from keeping 1.5 alive.
Is it a bit like arguing over who pays for the lifeboat as the ship sinks?
Yeah, it's a really good comparison. I think we'll see America steering the conversation in another direction. I think there is a concern now amongst Western climate diplomats that this cannot be the COP where 1.5 died. And I think they have legitimate concerns around some developing nations resisting discussions about 1.5. I can tell you it's not even on the formal agenda for discussion. Now, you can read that in a couple of different ways. You could read it as though actually Egypt is trying to tell the world that 1.5 is baked in and done, doesn't need discussing. But you could also read it as there has been a little bit of pushback from developing nations who are under the impression that 1.5 is just too hard to get to.
Yeah, so this totem of 1.5 seems a little bit missing in action currently at the moment. Meanwhile, outside of COP, some of the economics of moving to a lower carbon world are moving in the right direction, with fossil fuels being high, prices being high, and likewise investment in renewables. Is there a sort of potential coming together here that the actual transition to a lower carbon world, which is currently seen as really expensive, maybe doesn't have to be? And is that a kind of destination we can reach?
I think that's the thing that you're hearing big developed economies make the argument for, that going green is a massive economic opportunity. Politicians want to set the framework for that, but it is actually the case that that is what is happening to the flow of climate capital. You know, despite government sometimes, it's becoming cheaper to go green. Renewable energy is the cheapest kind of power we can make. That's where investors are going. Oil and gas are going to become stranded assets, and the investor community isn't so interested anymore. And I think that's actually what's underpinning what hope there is at this COP.
Since I spoke to Hannah, President Biden has arrived in Sharm later in the week than the rest of the world's leaders because of the US midterm elections. And you can keep up to date with everything that's happening throughout the summit by scanning the QR code here, which will take you to our climate homepage online. Last week, we asked you to send in your questions, and one people keep asking me of late is, are we getting enough rain to make up for the parched summer? And why do we still have some hosepipe bans? Cast your mind back a few months, and the phrase we kept hearing from the Met Office, repeated by reporters like me, was that we need to see meaningful rain over the winter. Meaningful rain. I love the idea of rain almost having a philosophical purpose. So, dictionary definite and meaningful, having a valid meaning, full of significance, expressive, capable of interpretation. But for those in the water business, it means higher than average rainfall to recharge reserves. This map from the Met Office uses the darkest brown to show where there's been the least amount of rain. The lighter brown and the white is where there's been most. East Sussex, Kent, West Sussex and the Isle of Wight have all received all their average November rainfall already, just in the first week. And these were some of the driest places in the summer. But in Tyne and Wear, there's only been 12% of their November rainfall so far. The Met Office still consider it to be a dry year overall, as so far we've had just 71% of annual average rainfall, and by now it should be closer to 85%. And the Environment Agency say water companies still need unusually heavy rain over winter months to recover. So, if you're getting drenched this Christmas, take comfort. It's meaningful rain. And as a footnote, we are aware that it's also been extraordinarily warm lately. After watching our show last week about carbon offsetting projects in Scotland planting native trees, Podmore got in touch with us via our app to ask, why are such projects not considering faster growing but non-invasive species like Paulonia, hemp, seagrass or maybe even bamboo? Well, let's take a look at a few of those. First of all, Scotland and what we were filming last week. Well, that was a Scottish rally, a Scottish race, and the organisers felt it was important for the offsetting to happen within Scotland. And for projects there, you really need to look at things like native trees, conifers, broadleafs, and they'll be getting to be planting those quite shortly. But you mentioned Paulonia, and guess what? We did a story about that in the summer. There's me sitting next to a particularly weedy and small example, but it's going to grow, and it's going to grow really fast. And that, as you suggest, is the point of Paulonia trees. And interestingly, there are some estates in the east of England who are already seeking carbon offset finance to grow forests of these trees. You also mentioned seagrass. Now, seagrass isn't technically seaweed. It grows through photosynthesis in shallow water around the coast. It used to be much more common just off the coast of Britain. Now it's quite rare. And once again, there are projects seeking to expand its area. I've seen them actually kind of seeding it on the seabed to get these great green meadows under the waves. So once again, it's a project that may well, as you suggest, get carbon offsetting finance. And of course, we'd love more questions from you. You can scan the QR code here or go to any of our social media accounts and put your questions in the comments. I'll be in Sharm el-Sheikh as COP27 draws to a close next week, and I'll be answering some of those questions with quite a bit of help from some summit delegates. That's all from us this week. Don't forget to join us next weekend when we'll have that special show from Sharm el-Sheikh, marking the final days of the COP27 summit and hopefully revealing some real progress. See you then.